Guys, here it is. We had okay. We can do. Okay. So are we ready? Okay. You guys ready to get started? You sure?
Last session, so I know we're all done.
Let's focus. For like 30 more minutes, and we'll be out of here. So you want to kick it off?
Yeah. So hi everyone. My name is Nikita. I work with data privacy, kind of broadly conceived. We usually work with protecting end users whenever they contribute their data anywhere. So I dabble in counter forensics, stuff like that.
And my name is Kenny Brown. I work for VMware. I've been there almost 5 years now. I started out doing senior consulting with them, so I was that for 4 years, and then 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, I decided I needed to be a project manager. So now I'm the program manager for federal healthcare, for better or for worse. I kind of don't like it, but hey, whatever. So this is why I come out and do these fun things on the weekend to still talk about tech stuff. So that's us. Kind of give you an overview of what we're going to talk about today and the festivities in store. So we'll kind of cover in the beginning the importance of wholesale data sanitization, why it's something that should be on everybody's radar, why you should care about it, why you shouldn't just kind of throw it to the back burner. We'll go over to the inadequacy of software and firmware-based sanitization. I put non-solutions there, so why these aren't really adequate choices to use. And we'll kind of cover a quick case study about solid-state drives, as these are relatively new to the market in terms of sanitization. Then we'll go over to the insufficiency of isolated, targeted hardware destruction options. And as a point in case for this, we'll kind of talk about what happens if you try to lose or get rid of a laptop and expound upon that a little bit. And then cover the keystone to our whole talk, physical sanitization solutions. And as a part of that, we'll cover an exothermic case study, which we have put together for our proven and preferred method of data destruction. So why is data destruction or sanitization paramount in today's society, or just in general? There's been a lot of rise in data breaches recently. I'm sure everybody reads the news and sees these things pop up frequently. And data breaches can come from a lot of different places. They can come from hacks, they can come from external, they can come from internal sources. And kind of a funny story, and 3 people or 2 people, and 3 in the back row can relate to this. We just had we did the hack, or whatever, the escape room a minute ago. And then one person had to be the mole, or the insider threat, and that was somehow chosen to be me. So I spent 30 minutes trying to derail the whole escape room thing. But I mean, it just goes to show that it could come from anywhere, and you don't really know who or who not to trust. So if you look at some recent examples of what has happened, February 15th, just a few days ago, FedEx had a massive breach, and they leaked over 100,000 documents, which contained images of passports, IDs, all sorts of things. So this is something that is, affects a lot of people. It was
just if we can do a poll, so how many of you guys have heard of this breach? And how many of you guys have used FedEx or had to scan some sort of ID for FedEx? So slightly more people have had to scan their documents than have heard of the breach. That should be troubling.
So this was kind of a large one. If you back up a couple weeks ago, February 7th, Octally was a marketing investment firm, or a firm, and they had a lot of leaks with over 12,000 social media different things that got out. Go back another week from that, the Chrome plugin called Grammarly had a leak. I'm sure, have you guys heard of that one recently? And yeah, so things happen. Bottom line up front, by the time it's news, it's already too late. And this goes back to the point of the whole slide, why is data destruction of paramount importance? So you don't make the news yourself. Continuing along this, talking about different methods of how things are gathered, we talk about mass dragnet surveillance and then targeted surveillance. So a recent example of the dragnet, a German intelligence firm has started focusing on digital forensics and telecom monitoring. They also monitor the dark web. So this began in September 2017. While they're not targeting anything specifically, it's just kind of a large, as I said, dragnet effort to try to garner information. And then for a more targeted one, Vault 7, which is a CIA collection of tools. These things exist to help monitor and, can compromise a lot of different things. For example, they can use your TVs in your house to listen in on what you're doing and see what you're watching and whatnot. And then also Word documents with the Scribble malware. So, yeah. Let's see the legal considerations of this. You guys might have attended an earlier session. I believe somebody talked about GDPR. And if you haven't, I can kind of give you a quick overview of it, or at least a part that's relevant to what we're talking about. So this takes effect May 25th, 2018. And Article 17, I will read this just for your edification. The data subject shall have the right to obtain from the controller the erasure of personal data concerning him or her without undue delay, and the controller shall have the obligation to erase personal data without undue delay. So anybody, what this really means is anybody from the EU dealing with anybody, if they request their data to be deleted, you have to do it. So, this kind of begs the question, why is it important? So if you have to get rid of it, we need to make sure it's actually gone and not just gone in your head.
All right, so that was a little bit of kind of the background on why this stuff is important. Now we'll talk a little bit about why kind of lots of the existing quote-unquote solutions or non-solutions, why they're insufficient. So the first we'll turn to kind of the field is so-called soft options. So this implies using both software and or firmware options. So most of you are probably familiar with standard hard disk sanitization methods, right? Gutman method, the DoD 7-pass, the Gutman 35-pass, D-ban, Derek's boot and nuke, right? These are all terms that have been bantered about for years. When we're talking about SSDs, they're useless, right? Because of the way that the data allocation works in SSDs, right? It's not based in any remotely the same capacity, so all you're doing is actually damaging your drive, but not to the, ironically, not to the point of data unrecoverability, right? So then that brings us to the first kind of big issue with using software firmware options, and that is the issue of recoverability. So there's many, many different ways of recovering data from ostensibly deleted media, right? From hard drives, solid state drives, all kinds of media. There's different methods, right? And we won't talk about those two because we're kind of playing the other side of how to prevent that recovery. So the issue here is that there's a lot of what we can call gotchas. So you think you run a particular command, you think you're doing everything right by the book, running the manufacturer or distributed firmware commands and so on, and then oops, something happens. So let's take the case study of solid state drives. So solid state drives, as you guys may know, there's two basic commands that we can issue to mark data for wiping. One is the trim command, and one is the secure erase command. So talking about trim first, if you run trim, and we'll get to that in a little bit, there's various programs that can help you automate the task and so on. And trim ostensibly marks data for erasure. So to be overwritten, right, you send a trim command which says, this chunk of data can now be overwritten, this block can be utilized, or this page can be utilized for something else. But this comes with a variety of gotchas. First of all, the drive may not even have trim enabled. Right? It's not a mandatory feature. If trim is enabled but DZAT is not enabled, then that data is marked for deletion but not deleted right away. Right? It's only marked for at some point in the future. Then if you're using an older OS, so lots of systems, right? We know he's way, way, way less than Windows 7 and so on. Then again, trim will also not work. If you're using a non-NTFS file system on Windows, trim will not work. If you're plugging in your drive with anything aside from serial ATA, if you're using PCI, USB, trim will not run successfully. Okay? If your devices are in most RAID configurations, there are some exceptions nowadays, but if your drives are in most RAID configurations, again, trim will not work. And finally, ironically enough, if your device is partially corrupted, so let's see how a damaged partition table or a damaged sector or a damaged page, trim will not work. So even though the data will not be mountable, it will still be recoverable, right? And that's an important distinction, right? Is even if you have a damaged, corrupted sectors or pages, the data can still be recoverable forensically, right? But it just can't be mounted. But ironically, you will not be able to wipe it if it's damaged. And then finally, and this is a big one, is firmware errors. All right, so this is what I mean by recoverability is you can recover data after running a trim or secure erase command if the command is flawed at the firmware level. And this brings us to unreliability. So AT secure erase, for instance, is unreliable, much like trim, because there's no indication, or no, let me rephrase it, no easy indication of the vendor having implemented it correctly. And for this, we could turn to a study conducted a few years ago in 2010 by White and Associates that tested 12 different solid-state drives for support of the sanitization feature sets of the ATA secure parameters. And they found, as you see here, only 8 out of 12 of the drives supported ATA in the secure erase and so on in the first place. Only 4 executed the erase command reliably. 2 then had non-functioning erase commands pending a firmware upgrade, and 1 claimed that it had ran sanitization correctly, but they found that not only was the data recoverable, the drive was even still mountable, right? So the option was basically a toy. And to circle back to firmware really quick, so let's say that we have one of these, vendor unspecified drives. We run AT secure erase. It says that everything has been done correctly. The drive has also been, encrypted with AT secure, so we can't even verify that the data has been successfully scrubbed, right? Because it's all gibberish for our purposes. And then months down the line, we think everything is fine, and then we get a firmware upgrade for the drive, and we read the release notes, and we note that they actually have a little footnote at the bottom that says AT secure erase command updated. And we go, wait, what? Yeah, we're not talking about any specific vendors, but this has happened out in the wild where drive manufacturers obviously don't want to make a lot of noise about this, so they will silently push firmware upgrades that will then fix the vulnerability that was there, but that, of course, invalidates the entire erasure process. So the point of this is that using firmware commands is unreliable. So the next thing to do is, before we get to other solutions, what can we do in terms of software? What kind of solutions do we have if the erasure commands are unreliable? Well, the sort of solution is to preemptively run full disk encryption on the drive. So as soon as you acquire a new piece of media, the first step should be to run FDE, right? And there's a variety of options. Right? We have VeriCrypt for Windows, Linux, and so on. We have Lux. We have FileVault 2 for Mac. And ideally, as I say, this should be done preemptively, right? This should be done as soon as you receive a new piece of media before any data is actually stored on it. But, we all, let's say, quote unquote, forget to run FDE on USSDs sometimes, right? Or does everyone remember? Sometimes we're a little forgetful.
Or you forget the password.
Yeah. So sometimes what happens is we could run secure erase on the drive first, and again, I mentioned earlier there's a variety of tools to help us. There's HDD erase for Windows, there's HDPAR for Linux, and there's vendor-specific tools that oftentimes ship with a driver that you can get from the vendor site, and then you can encrypt the data. Though this is not ideal, because in this situation you're basically closing your eyes and praying, right, that the secure erase actually worked. So the ideal solution is to get a new drive if you're dealing with particularly sensitive data. So in other words, running FDE retrospectively is not the ideal solution, but something that's the realistic solution in case we don't have enough budget or something. So now that we've talked about kind of the soft approaches, right, and by soft we both mean software and firmware, we could turn to talking about hard approaches to data sanitization.
So kind of the genesis of this whole presentation is to talk about physical being our preferred method, but there are several other physical methods that are not necessarily the most viable options that you could use for trying to destroy hard drives. I'll give you a few examples here. There's many, many more other ones, but these kind of seem to be some bigger key ones that people have talked about or you hear about. So an acid bath, or they call it King's water. It's a combination of nitric and muriatic acids. They usually combine these two because nitric might get rid of some stuff, muriatic the other one, so combining them kind of gets the best of both worlds. While it does end up destroying a lot of stuff, there are some downsides to it. The time investment, having to go out and actually procure the chemicals from whatever various places you can find around town. I think there is somewhere that sells nitric, not that I've looked in Tampa, but just saying. And it's there could be acid-resistant components within the devices, so titanium and iridium, there's a whole slew of them, you can read them, things that aren't necessarily affected by these two. So while it will get rid of it, it could result in something less than optimal, like etching of the disk. And even then, you have to dismantle the whole thing, so you'll be left with the casing, and you'll have other physical evidence, which we'll talk about in a minute. But things like MAC addresses, IP, non-volatile RAM stuff, everything else is kind of left. And that's also kind of plays into the next one. So drilling, I know people said you drill disks, and that's cool, you can do that, sure, but there's some downsides. It takes time, and it even does leave stuff on the disks that could be recovered. I mean, it takes a lot of time and money. It's not the cheapest method, but there are ways to try to pull partial data off of things like that. And then drive shredding. It sure is a good one. It will get rid of the drive, but there's a lot of downside. Or there's a main downside to that is the money. So if you want to go out and buy one, starting at maybe $5,000. So if you have the pocket change, by all means. But for most common people and companies, you'll try to rent that out, and then you kind of fall back to the reliance of external contractors for holding your data. So kind of like the paper shredding trucks, they come and they show up, and what do they really do after that? So even if they shred it on site, you kind of have it. So those are those. So then, You can talk about it. Sure. No, go right ahead. Go right ahead. Okay, so looking at this overall, so the, isolated component sanitization is not holistic, like I said previously. So you try to get rid of a piece of it, but you don't get rid of the whole thing. So there's other things that are left, which I mentioned a minute ago: MAC addresses, IMEI numbers, non-volatile RAM stuff. There's plenty of other things that could leave, a footprint or a breadcrumb trail back to who and or what this is. And this kind of segues up to a brief case study in a second. And there's also the chance that you have unremoved storage. So say you throw out a laptop and you leave your SD card in there. Whoops. Or, a lot of things like that. And then there's the obvious forensic stuff. So you could leave fingerprints if you don't think about it, or you could leave, hair follicles, fibers from clothing, a lot of different things. Just the place where it is, location where you dump it could be relevant to whatever they're trying to find. So the point here is that, while you could target certain things in a hard drive by drilling it or bathing it in acid, it's not really the best, most holistic way to get rid of it. Now you can talk.
So let's say that, we have this particular case where we want to upload a document securely and traceably, right? So anonymously, in other words. And this case will illustrate what the problem is with targeted hardware attacks, in other words, as opposed to wholesale destruction methods. So let's say you use a laptop, you go to a coffee shop, right, because you don't want any traces. You upload the document, then you take out your drive, let's say you had a flash drive or something in it, and then you throw the rest of the laptop out because it doesn't matter. You take the data, you crush the thumb drive, and then you think you're done. Let's say that then that laptop is recovered from the nearby dumpster. Let's say that in turn the MAC address is then exfiltrated from the wireless network card, right, that you still have in the laptop. Let's say that then the access point logs are checked for which MAC address is connected at which particular time, right, and then correlated to which data was uploaded where, right? So now you have a MAC linked to a specific device, linked to a specific location, and then combine that with what Kenny mentioned earlier, the forensic markers, right, the latent fingerprints left in the device, and so on, and now you have a good chunk of evidence, right? So this is all things that you need to consider when you take what Kenny described as a holistic approach, right? So that's why wholesale destruction is absolutely necessary.
So before we get into kind of our recommended, solution to fixing things like that, I want to bring up something before somebody's going to ask. I'm sure somebody will beg the question, well, what the hell for, environmental purposes. But, what about recycling? Even if you do recycle, they tend to use a lot of chemicals therein. So you could extract what you need, but you have to kill, 8,000 trees to do it or something. So, case in point there. And another option is to try to pass it off on somebody else. So say you just want to give the laptop to somebody. That's cool, but then you just pass off culpability to the next person. So, then it has a third party involved. So it's not only you that has the effect, it's the next person, and then there's just a whole slew of things that kind of add up to not being good. So this kind of all boils down to personal risk management. How much you really want to get into it and what, your levels of risk are acceptable. So
with all of that disclaimer in mind, we can turn to a specific case study, which we'll call wholesale sanitization with thermite. And we'll get into the explanation of what all this stuff is.
Demonstration? No?
Sort of.
Workshop.
So,
preliminary workshop.
So thermite, for those of you who may not be aware, it's a powdered mixture, roughly 3 parts by weight, notably not by volume. This is a mistake that people sometimes make, and it doesn't burn properly, but it's 3 parts to 1 part by weight, okay, not by volume. And then you take powdered iron oxide, or rust, effectively, and 1 part aluminum, again, powdered aluminum. You mix them together, you place them in a container. Through extensive testing, we found that a terracotta pot works nice. We'll get to that in a second, but they're not as hard as one would think.
We'll give you a shopping list.
And
later.
then finally, because of the high ignition temperature of thermite, we can't just start it, with a match or a lighter. We need to use a starter fuel, and for that we can use magnesium, basic magnesium fuse. And the reason we use this is because it's fairly easily obtainable. To get to your point, we could get magnesium ribbon or a common sparkler. Then you ignite it, you watch your data burn, and then you can finally sleep soundly at night. So now let's go into where to get the ingredients a little bit more. So we start with iron oxide. Okay, iron oxide, as I said, for intents and purposes, is basically rust. Okay, so where can you get rust? Out in the tool shed from a pottery supplier, right? Because iron oxide is used as a pigment. You could order just chemical rust from Amazon, for instance, or anywhere. You could make your own rust, right, through oxidization, right? So if you put a nail into a bath of salt water, right, and then speed that process up by hooking it up to a battery, you'll get a rusty nail in a few hours, right? And then if you repeat that in a slightly bigger scale, you could get all the rust you need. Aluminum, once again, powdered aluminum, you could go out to the store, get a couple aluminum pans, crush them together, put them in a coffee grinder, grind them down for a little bit, and you'll have powdered aluminum. Or you could get it from an art supply store. You could, again, once again, turn to trusty Amazon to get it. That brings us to magnesium. And again, as I said earlier, magnesium was the preferred starting mechanism because we could get it from common sparklers, from magnesium ribbon, again, Amazon. And there you have the three main chemicals that we need. They're all readily accessible. And that's also the neat thing about thermite is the ingredients are easy to come by, right? They're not regulated, right? Because we're not making an explosive, right? We're just making an exothermic reaction, right? So everything is very easily obtainable. It's all in the up and up. And then we need a few supplementary ingredients. We need a plastic bag or some sort of container for mixing because we're going to mix them all together. We need, as we said, a container for mixing and then a container for the actual ignition. Yes?
Do you have an Amazon wish list you can link this?
Actually, if you go to Amazon and if you search for powdered iron oxide, you know how Amazon suggests people who buy this also buy? You'll have the magnesium.
One button.
So it's already taken care of for you. So it's all very streamlined. And again, even buying the ingredients together, right, there's nothing kind of unsafe about this, right? Because again, this is all, again, stressed that this is all fairly legal, right? So there's nothing concerning about going and buying all the three ingredients at once, right? You're not going to be on any lists in particular.
By no means are we promoting doing this, but just saying it's.
And then, like I said, you'll need some sort of container for mixing. We just find a resealable, zippy bag works fine. And then we need a container to actually hold our mixture. We found that terracotta pots with a drainage hole on the bottom work great. Once you're filling it up, be sure to plug the hole with a thin layer of aluminum or something so it doesn't all pour out as you're moving it. And then you need a scale, of course, to measure because, again, I stress that the ingredients have to be measured by weight, right, not by volume. And then you need a lighter. And then in the talk blurb, we promised to talk about safety. So the safety is that you need an outdoor space and so on and so forth.
Don't try this at home. With Prime, you could do it tomorrow, though.
So to go through the process a little bit more. Right? So we take 3 parts iron oxide to 1 part aluminum, or specifically the ratio is, if you want to be exact, 80 to 27. It's roughly 3 to 1. It doesn't need to be exact. Basically, the more aluminum you have, the faster the thermite will burn, and also the coarser the aluminum is, the slower it will burn, and the finer it is, the faster it will burn. And that will effectively depend on how much you're trying to destroy, because a slower burn may be desirable, but that also raises the ignition temperature. So what you may want to do is, instead of using 1 sparkler, tie 2 sparklers together, right? Right, to increase the ignition temperature. So you measure out your ingredients. Then we mix it up. So we just found that dumping them into a resealable bag, then mixing them, and then after you mix them, because the iron pigment is the stronger pigment, it will completely overshadow the aluminum, so you will not be able to tell that there's any in there, and the impulse will be, wait, did I not add any? Should I add some more? Don't do that, because that effectively kind of turns the reaction into flash powder, and it will make it go too fast to actually heat up and burn through all the data. So don't worry if after you mix it up, it'll just look like you still have your bag of iron oxide. So you will not be able to see aluminum, and don't worry, that's actually part of the, in other words, it's supposed to be that way. So that's the before and that's the after. You see the aluminum vanishes, but it resists the impulse to add more to it. So then we place it in our burning container. And here we have the drainage hole on the bottom, and we already have it placed on top of our target device.
Is that pot full?
Yes, but that's a little.
It was a small pot.
We actually found that it's a little bit too much, so if you notice in the next one, we narrow it down a little bit. And so here we have.
Do you know how much you need per hard drive?
It varies. We found that about 30 to 10 grams. So about 40 grams of oil, just a random figure, not based on months of actually testing in Kenny's backyard. But here, so we have, as I mentioned before, if you want to get a slightly higher ignition temperature, you can use 2 sparklers tied together. And you can just place it in. And then after we add the fuse,
Shitty projector.
we ignite with an ordinary lighter. And then again, remember, safety considerations are paramount, so step back. The thermite usually does not sputter, but it does burn intensively. So you don't have to worry about any sputter getting anywhere. At least if you're destroying a hard drive, if you're destroying something that has a battery, then you will need to back up a little bit more. And then, so finally, after the exothermic reaction actually takes place, we have our before and our after. And as we said, that we feel that this will successfully foil any kind of forensic recovery process. So play the video.
Yeah. So we have
So just to kind of sink this point home, we did the kind of the graphic presentation. Now we have a quick video to demonstrate this. There's no sound, so don't worry about that.
that works. And then we're going to prepare for our workshop portion while you watch this.
Lord, look at that.
That's pretty cool.
At what point during this do you believe the hard drive is fully non-recoverable?
Now, go ahead and edit.
As soon as the basically as soon as the thermite leaks out, it goes through.
That's done.
Chef's hat, too. Take it serious here.
I hope you're gonna like something.
I'll go to our house later.
So now it's cooking time. So what we have here is our bag of chemical grade iron oxide. Right? This is the good shit, as they say. Then we have our bag of aluminum powder, and this is the standard kind of chemical quantity that we could get. It's 30 micron 500 mesh. You don't want to go too fine because, again, as I said, it burns too fast, and you don't want to go too coarse because then the ignition temperature rises. So 500 mesh, perfect.
Yeah, helping you out.
And so here we have our sample target device. I'll place that here for now. And here we have, incidentally, depending on where you get your powdered aluminum, it also comes with a handy measuring spoon. And so we have our scale here. And we find that paper plate works fine.
And what he said too, be sure to do this by weight, not necessarily volume. So that's kind of important. Just because you do 3 scoops of whatever doesn't mean it's necessarily the same.
Yep. So then we take note of the weight, set it aside, we set the scale, and then we do our iron.
Don't do this in your kitchen. It doesn't make for a happy wife either. Yeah. And then just a terracotta pot, and you can line it with a piece of aluminum foil to make sure it doesn't run out.
You don't have to call outdoors for this?
Well, I'm not going to light it.
We
You can come light it if you want.
wouldn't worry about it. We wouldn't worry about it. Just go with it.
It is the end of the day. It's pretty
Absolutely.
So now we have our 2 measured out aluminum and iron oxide. If there's anything left to be invited to. We add it in, and we seal our bag.
Not exactly science by any means. Just a weight.
Then we place our container on top of our target device, though ours is lined with a thin layer of foil so that we can move it around if we need to. So in other words, don't forget that you have a hole at the bottom of this when you're moving it around.
And then I'm not going to dump it in there. We should dump it. It's kind of a mess.
And we could dump it in,
Stick
take
sparklers
our
on it.
sparklers,
stick them in, and then light them. Then step back, and then enjoy what we did in the video.
Yep.
So,
Then move back.
anyway, let me get back to the last slide of this thing.
Nice.
So this brings us to the key takeaways here. So if you take a look at the rise of data breaches and surveillance and legal requirements that we have, as we talked about in the beginning, and added up with the combined unreliability of software, firmware, and some hardware targeted techniques, it all culminates in the need for wholesale exothermic device destruction, which is what we demonstrated, or in theory demonstrated. So, very end, the question is to burn all the things. So,
So, any questions?
and that brings us to the end. Questions? That is all we have. Thank you guys for coming out.
Thank you, guys.